in captivity, they get accustomed to taking orders, for they're under the authority of their captors. And so when you look at the Egyptians, that was all that they really knew. They knew the whip and what that meant, and you get to work, and here's when you can eat. But now that they're liberated and emancipated from all of that, it's not that they can think that they can just be a law unto themselves now. God is saying, no, here's your code that you're going to abide by. Here's your constitution that will, in fact, distinguish you from the nations round about, and it will show that you're my own special people.
Well said. Thank you, Justin. And we're going to see this, and so we'll try our best. Alan said, now, devote 2 classes to this chapter. And I said, you're nuts. But anyway, we're going to give it our best shot. The first commandment, let's look at it. The first commandment. Who knows what the first commandment is? Yeah. It says in the very first commandment, verse 7, you shall have no other gods before me. Okay. So the question is, if we look on, look at our book, it'd be page 18. So why would other gods take priority over God? What motivation would people have for turning to other gods? They don't trust what they can't see. Good point. Good answer. There are many answers, so don't feel bad like I'm not looking for anything specific.
Hedge around themselves, they want to make sure they cover all the bases. So this God, and they're all friendly to me. I got to be doing good.
Well, I see. Just
Egyptian bondage, they had witnessed a lot of idolatry. They'd seen this god or that god or this goddess or that goddess appealed to. And so God is saying it's not going to be that way with you, not at any point.
I want you to pay attention to what Justin said a while ago on the tail end of his remarks, and we'll get into it, and that is that this people was going to be different, and that is going to make an impression on all of their neighbors. And we'll get into the minutia of that later on. Brother Paul.
Ever so often that God's abandoned them, when of course it's not feeling. And these people being enslaved got them in no really good faith.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Got to be new. Why does it have to be new? Anybody else? Thou shalt have no other gods before me. He demands, and this is the yes, sir.
They had scouted out the land. They knew, like the people of Jericho, that the land was full of milk and honey. They had these huge grapes and everything. They could look at the way these people were blessed and say, oh, their God is strong. They're materially blessed, and say, oh, we need to worship him too.
Yeah. But the verse that kills all this, he tells them why.
You mean verse 6? I brought you out of the house of, I brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. And that's going to come back and eat at us here in a few minutes. The thing is, in a nutshell, we have to see, in a nutshell, God demands absolute faithfulness. Now, in addition to loving God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and your neighbor as yourself, the third command, I'm paraphrasing here. This is the gospel according to Frank. The third command is absolute faithfulness. And so when you're drawing Hugh's hedge around yourself and want to please God, you have to include those three things in that bag of tricks that you have so that you can be precious in the sight of God, among others. But you have to understand He demands absolute faithfulness, and it pervades all of these commandments as we get them on. In the second commandment, I'm sorry. Harold, I didn't see it.
Here in verse 6 and 7, when he's starting all these commandments, was it anybody here in these verses that had crossed the Red Sea or had all them people already died? So it's only 3 or 4 people here that knew the original slavery that they were in.
You know, Darrell, that is such an easy question. I'm going to let Justin answer it.
Was it a question or a statement?
It was a question.
A question?
How many of the ones that crossed the Red Sea heard the Deuteronomy message?
Well, you've got Joshua and Caleb. Don't forget about them.
Okay. Many of those, I think we asserted in the opening that most of the people that came across the Red Sea had died.
So they're hearing this law for the first. Many are hearing this law for the first time.
And so you're looking at 20 years and younger when they would have heard God speak from the mountain, but now they're older. The parents have now passed away. And so a lot of time had passed, and it's a good reminder now that they're a more serious age.
See, that's the justification for sermons on the family, isn't it? Yeah. Brother Montz has a good lesson prepared for us today. So, any other question? You had your hand up. Oh, you were pointing to Darrell. I'm sorry. I told Sherilyn I got new glasses, but they don't seem to be helping very much. Okay, let's talk about the second commandment. If you look at the second commandment, you shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that's in the heaven above or on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth, and you shall not bow down to them or serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. That's one of the wordiest commands, I guess, as far as is what you're going to have. When you think about the second command, you're not to have any images, any carved images. Now, we've discussed this a little bit about about apparel that we might wear or jewelry we might wear. It might happen to be cross-shaped. But when we think about this, when we think about this, we notice that God prohibits making any carved image or physical likeness. Carved images receive worship and service. Can't have that. Rivaling what would be given to God. So, again, in the first commandment, absolute faithfulness. So what does he say? He says the word for likeness is the same word we saw in 4:15, where it states that God's form or likeness was not seen at Mount Sinai. This is very interesting. And this is what the nations around had to get used to, that God's people didn't have images all over the place, as Hugh pointed out a moment ago. They weren't like the Egyptians. They didn't have images everywhere. And so it was strange to the average worshiper, and I say that loosely. Well, here's God's people, and they don't have any idols. What What's with that? Why do they do that? And so we see then that God has never been seen by man. So how can you have an idol? You see, how can you have an idol? And then they have nothing to say. Now watch. They have nothing to say. They can't hear, and they're powerless. And that's been demonstrated time and again throughout the Old Testament in the various and sundry times that God showed the people how powerless the worshipers of idols were. And you can talk about it just all day. An idol would not capture the essence of God, but simply diminish it. Now, what do we know? We know that God is alive and well. We know that God speaks. We've already talked about that. So you see, we don't need a carved image. We need to learn that these activities distract the worshiper from the committed love that God wanted us to cultivate. And this committed love, you see, we're going to talk about the parents' responsibility here in a few minutes. But the seed that's sown in the minds of children and grandchildren, they too forget the reasons for worship. And so we need to sow these seeds into our children's mind. And of course, all of Israel's neighbors, as we've already said, used some kind of idol for worship. And Israel alone refused to have any imagery, you see. And so we are impressed with that. But notice the other part, and that is this second commandment. The tail end is of interest to me. I'd love to hear what Justin says about it. But notice he says, at the end of this, you shall not make a carved image. And then he says, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. What in the world has that got to do with idols? What has that got to do with idols? You see, the second commandment contains a warning and a promise, acting in loving kindness to the thousands toward those who love me and keep my commandments. How did it work? Go ahead, Hugh. I'll let you out on that limb.
You're saying at the time they were here, they didn't have idols. But later on, we know throughout their history, the kingdom and all that, and the judges, they put up idols. They started worshiping idols. Every 40 years, they seem to pick on and worship something else. And during the kings, they worshiped other things. I think God is just looking ahead, saying, I know what is going to enter your hearts. I know what's going to pull you away from me, and I'm telling you now to stay away from it.
Okay. All right.
Before that he was a jealous God and visited those that hated him. So he was saying, but I show mercy on those that love him.
But showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. Okay? Let you talk. Then I'll let Justin. All right. Told them what not to do, and then told them what to do. Thank you, Brother Paul. Go ahead, Justin.
The wicked may prosper for a little while. Like you could look at, for instance, with Sodom and Gomorrah, very vile, very filthy, but they had productive land. Fire from God fell from the sky. And so what I believe the take home of all of this is that when you remember Moses giving the blessings for obedience and then the curses for disobedience, you could see how God was pointing out, I am your true provider. And if you turn to a false god, that which is dead and not living like me, while you might prosper for a little while, ultimately judgment is in fact going to come. And I can't help but think about the prayer of Jonah when he was in the belly of the great fish. It says there in Jonah chapter 2, verse 7, "When my soul fainted within me, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer went up to you and to your holy temple. Those who regard worthless idols forsake their own mercy, but I will sacrifice to you with the voice of thanksgiving. I'll pay what I have vowed. Salvation is of the Lord." True deliverance is always going to be found with Yahweh, Jehovah, this true God that you have here, Moses educating the people about.
Good point. Good point. Remember, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Mark.
If we go back to what God said of his people in Genesis chapter 6, when he said and he mentioned about the thoughts and intents of their hearts, that it was evil continually, and the reasoning for the taking of all those who were wicked off of the planet, basically. And you think about man being created in the image of God, how can man, with those thoughts, even get anywhere near the image of God who created us in his image? And we think that that is equal to that. So it's really a vile blasphemy of consideration when we think about things that we hold up so highly in this earth that become so valuable to us that it's not worth a speck of dust as far as our soul's concerned. But when you think about how we often turn our allegiance away from God to that thing or that person, and that's no different in God's eyes as to how we present ourselves to him every day of our lives. So as you think about that carved image, remember how God made us in his image. Therefore, it can't be duplicated.
Can't be duplicated. Well said. Let's look at anybody else. Let's look at number 3. The third commandment. And if you're reading in chapter 5, it says, verse 11, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain." So we ask the question, and I like what Brother Jeremy says in his class notes here about the third commandment. It can be rendered, "You shall not lift up the name of the Lord your God to vanity." So, Hugh, you want to give us that everyday man's understanding of that?
I was Googling gods of Egypt. Sorry about that. Googling the gods of Egypt. I don't know what to say. He said, things in heaven, things on earth, things under the sea. And they had cats, calves, eagles, hawks, everything. They would worship all kinds of animals like them. That's where they came out of. So I was just checking to see what kind of gods they had in Egypt.
Well, in street language, this is where God prohibits us from manipulating God for purely personal ends. So write that down. Manipulating God for purely personal ends. And then start filling the bucket with stupid stuff, That's what it amounts to. Now, why is that? He's already told us why is that? Well, he said, "I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Lord spake with you face to face at the mountain," you see. And then he said in the very first place, "You shall have no other gods before you." See? The name of the Lord. What is the name of the Lord? All right, let's just do it this way. The last time you were cruising through Millersville at 46 miles an hour, the officer said, "Stop in the name of the law." That was the blue lights. And then he came to your door and said, "You've broken the law." And so by the authority vested in him, by the order, by the law of the state of Tennessee, he stops you. And you recognize that right by politely stopping, keeping your mouth shut, and doing everything he said. Now, I'm not meaning to blaspheme God by comparing him to the police department here in Millersville. That's not the point. The point is the name of God. Or as Paul said, whatever you do in word and in deed, do all in the name of the Lord. And what does the preacher always say at the end of that? Or by his, starts with an A. Authority. That's right. And if it's not there, then you don't do it. You see, so it's pretty simple.
When you were asking that question, I wasn't prepared, but now I am. But when you take the name of Lord in any way, you're making the Lord your puppet. You are making him guarantee I'm telling the truth, guaranteeing I'm going to have a good life. I want to pull him in and use him to make everything good for me. And that really, it just, God is now something you use instead of something you worship. Okay.
Thank you.
I think the idea of reverence is also connected with this too. And I think about when the commandment was first given over there at Horeb, Sinai, and you've got how the people had to wash their clothes and show up, and God thunders from the mountain. And you could also think about how when the Lord spoke through the burning bush there to Moses, he told him to take those sandals off because the place where you stand is holy ground. And so when you think about this idea of reverence, vanity is the opposite of it, where people are just in a very flippant way, a casual manner, throwing out the name of God, and not really thinking about who he is as the master and creator of this whole universe.
Okay. Dr. Johnson, go ahead.
I was just going to say, as well as not only being unreverent, but also they were in some ways appointed to be the representatives of God to all other nations. And so, as God's representatives, not misrepresenting God would, in my mind, be part of this. They were, I guess, they were representatives of God and God's will, and how God would use them to save all nations. And so, as God's representatives, they were not to misrepresent him and his name.
Took the words right out of my mouth. Thank you very much. But let's bring it in here. How do we use, now we understand all this stuff about what the world does, but how do we use God's name in vain? We the people, we the called out of God, right here in this building, the church at Millersville. How do we use God's name in vain? Or how can we use the word, respectable vanity? That's what I'm trying to get. Mark?
Then myself, the sinner, has vilely spoke out loud, even if I'm by myself, and said the word God bless. And I didn't say that in a positive way. I said that in a negative context. I don't remember or recall when or where I was. But people say that kind of thing today without any thought of, like, God, I want you to bless myself or my family or others. But saying it is another phrase as someone else would use in the world that would have a different ending, if you will. But it means the context would be the same. And so when we put God associated with any other ending, then we better be careful, because in our own vain mind, we think, well, that's my out. I can get by with that. I'm not really bringing God down, but we are. But we have desensitized ourselves to think that we're okay if we don't go the next step.
Thank you very much.
Justin?
When we act upon our own authority, but then try to pretend as though God himself endorses our conduct or the decisions we make, the innovation that we put into his worship, that can be a form of taking God's name in vain.
Okay. Looked at the article in the bulletin, and it's about basically you're teaching other people, you're trying to get other people to be members of this church. You don't want to come off as haughty. You don't want to come off as arrogant and say, I'm speaking for God. You need to listen. I'm right, you're wrong. That kind of stuff, that just turns people off, but it's also taking God's name in vain when you say that.
Right?
Yeah, Alan did 3 articles before he left for Israel, and they're excellent articles. Now, I want you to be sure, if you don't have a bulletin today, get one before you leave to see that. God's name in vain. We have to, what does James say? Every good gift and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. And how can we say anything to God or about God or to any of God's children that is less than that, you see? And one of the favorite things is in domestic relationships, where life gets tough sometimes, or in the family relationship. I'm going to plow in the preacher's field right now. In the family relationship, where strife gets so tense at home that we forget that our spouse is one of God's children and we need to save their souls. And we forget that our children are blessings from God and that we have to save their souls. And we can't conduct ourselves in such a way as to take that privilege away from God. You see, God wants to, seek and save, wants us to seek and save the lost. He wants to save everybody. So we have to, this is such a pervasive command that the more I think about it, the worse I get. It makes me think that I need to, pour some Drano in my brain and clean it all out, because I just, it's so involved. Who wants to have the last word?
Well, real quick, I'm thinking about if we spend more of our time, or what's the opposite of that? And making sure that the brethren here, we focus on what it means to truly reverence God. Out of the word we read in the Bible often is called fear. That means to revere, to respect, to bring up into awe. That needs to be in our basic vocabulary, that we understand what that truly means. From the eldership to the minister, to the deacons, to the members, we're all got to be on the same page. Like we're here to revere God. When we come into this building, we're coming up into a physical building that has no reverence activity or anything about it. As far as that's concerned, is that we revere this building, but we revere what comes into this building, which is each and every soul that represents God, is what we call the church. That is where we've got to respect, revere God through that love that we share with each other. But we've got to be focused on teaching each other what that word to revere God means. And that has to be in our home life, not just here in our church life, when we're together as a family.
Anybody else? So be careful be careful that you don't, to me, one thing I've got to say is that we can't take God's place. And in street language, we want to send people to places that we don't have the power to do that. And I like what Mark said a minute ago, have a blessed day. Well, how do you have a blessed day? You have a blessed day of doing the commandments of God, and you'll be blessed. And that's what we can do, is show people how that God blesses. And in that sense, as Grant said a moment ago, we're using our influence to turn the world toward God. That's the biggest thing that we can do. Now, we're gonna take up number 4. Wednesday night, invite all of you to come back. Very interesting study. And come back, make time to come back Wednesday night. All of you come back and let's talk about the Sabbath day. That's a very interesting topic too. Have you ever thought about what it would be like if Adam and Eve had never sinned in the garden? Think about that. We'll see you Wednesday night, Lord willing. Thank you for your time and attention, and very enjoyable class for me.